It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation day, which engages with the theme, "The Kingdom of God is in our midst," rediscovering sacred spaces, past and present. And this is a special day for us, not only because of the fascinating theme it is addressing, but because it marks the formal beginning of an important cooperation, that between the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, England, and the University of Saint Katherine in San Diego, California, US. As many of you already know, the University of Saint Katherine is a nationally recognized American university founded and rooted in the life of the Orthodox Christian tradition. The Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, or IOCS for short, is the pan-Orthodox house for theological studies in the ancient city of Cambridge, functioning with the formal approval and blessing of the Pan-Orthodox Episcopal Assembly for Great Britain and Ireland. Actually, our two institutions have signed a memorandum of agreement for academic cooperation in 2019. And this is a cooperation which we very much hope to further materialize through similar joint events in the near future, but most importantly, through a jointly taught Master of Arts in Eastern Orthodox Studies, hopefully by the next academic year, if everything goes well. Therefore, we have two speakers in conversation today, representing the two institutions, Dcn David-John Williams, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Saint Katherine, and Father Dragos Herescu, who is the Principal of IOCS. And I'll say a few words about the two speakers very briefly because we do not have a lot of time. So Dcn David is a postgraduate researcher in the Department of History at Royal Holloway University of London, where he is exploring shared sacred spaces in the Byzantine Mediterranean. He has taught since 2016 as Assistant Professor of History at the University of Saint Katherine, as I've already mentioned. He has served the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of Western America as a deacon since 2014. A Byzantinist by training, Dcn David is especially interested in the reconstruction of the sacred in the various religious traditions of the Mediterranean. Today, Dcn David will speak about holy mountains, the creation and recreation of sacred space through images, ritual, and memory. Dcn David will comment on hierotopic devices, in other words, the means by which sacred space can be made and repeated at home and online. So a very topical approach indeed. The second speaker for the day is our own principal, Father Dragos Herescu, and it always gives me a particular joy to be able to introduce him, as he has been a dear friend and a colleague at IOCS for more than a decade. Father Dragos is in the last stage of completing his doctoral thesis with Durham University on the secularization paradigm in the context of Eastern Orthodoxy. He has been teaching for many years at undergraduate and postgraduate level for our institute and for the Cambridge Theological Federation. Indeed, he is himself a product of IOCS, as I keep teasing him. As many years ago, he graduated from our MA in Pastoral Theology. So you'd be hard-pressed to find someone more suited to represent our institute than someone who has studied, worked, and taught for IOCS for almost 14 years, if not more. Father Dragos will speak on sacred space and sacred action, exploring a theological taxonomy of pilgrimage and the geography of the holy in secular context. The first speaker of the day, however, will be Dcn David-John Williams, who will be speaking on holy mountains, the creation and recreation of sacred space through images, ritual, and memory. The structure of the day is that the first speaker gives his presentation, after which the other speaker gives a response, after which the floor is open for questions from the audience. We have roughly an hour for all of that. So without further ado, Dcn David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. It's very heartening, and I'm sure that we'll have lots of really good questions, I hope, in the end. And I guess not that much time to get through them if we have so many people. But so it falls to me, I guess, to just briefly go over what at least I interpret sacred space to mean and what I find most convincing. Although all of us, I think, certainly the guests here, have at least a strong intuition of what sacred space is. It's something that we can describe, something that we feel very, very strongly, and something that we're drawn to. We orientate our lives around sacred spaces, and indeed, cities are planned around them. We make pilgrimages to them, etc. So I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of different ways that sacred space has been described and how it's made. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is the one that I find the most convincing, and I think the one that most, certainly Orthodox, would find to be the most natural. And that is the understanding of sacred space as a space that has been marked off from profane or mundane space by an eruption of the divine, by a manifestation of God. And this is termed hierophany by the Romanian historian of religions, Eliade, and it's been taken up, revised a number of times, but I think that it's the one that we can understand the most. If we think about the major sacred sites, certainly in the Christian tradition, they generally are intimately connected with some form of divine manifestation. We think about or some other very important time or event in, for example, the person of Jesus Christ. If we think about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, if we think about Mount Sinai, okay, there are many examples. And then if we look also at the lives of saints, this is generally where we get shrine churches, the site of a martyrdom or the site of a miracle. And so when this manifestation of divine power occurs, the site becomes ontologically different than the profane space around it. And one of the sort of main characteristics of that ontological change is it just cannot be reverted back to its previous mundane or profane status. The divine has broken through permanently. And so that poses a couple of interesting questions for us, and then certainly for secularization, but also interreligious understandings of space and use of space as well. The one example that comes to mind right now, because of all of the conversations and controversy that surround it, would be the case of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which, I guess that they have delayed making the decision now, but there is a strong desire among certain political factions or persons to revert the building to its status as a mosque. And of course, Orthodox Christians and others, the Hagia Sophia can only be the great church of Byzantium. We look at it this way, even though, of course, from 1453 till what I think halfway through the last century, it did serve indeed as a mosque. And there are a whole slew of hierotopic devices that were used by the Ottomans, for example, to prove that it had always, in fact, been a mosque. It had just had its destiny sort of fulfilled with the conquest of Constantinople, but we can talk about that maybe later. There are also other cases with the secularization of churches, for example. I know that in the Anglican Communion and maybe some other traditions, I'm not entirely sure of, but that there are, for example, prayers that are said when a church is desacralized, which is a very interesting concept. How does that happen? And if a church is turned into a mosque, is it still a church? Why does that happen? Does the Muslim congregation move into that space, accepting that there is some form of pre-existing sacra in that building? It's kind of complicated. But the other form, the other methodology for understanding sacred space that I'm going to just bring up briefly is the situational approach. So if we have, on the one hand, the ontological approach, the other situational, this was popular among anthropologists, certainly in the early 90s, and they argued that, and this has particular relevance, I think, to shrines and pilgrimage spaces, that the shrine or the sacred space actually is devoid of meaning, and we project meaning onto it. And I think that this theory comes from the fact that a lot of pilgrimage spaces are shared, and so they don't mean the same thing to every single pilgrim. A pilgrim, from an educated background, is going to view the space as different to someone else. A Muslim or a Jew is going to view even, say, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, a shared site, in a very, very different way. Nevertheless, they regard it as sacred. So we can think about spaces as being palimpsest, where multiple narratives and meanings are written, often contradicting one another, on top of each other. But that approach basically says that we create the sacred meaning of a space. We project it, in a way, I suppose you could say. And then the other, I think, very interesting way that sacred space is constructed is this term of hierotopia. The way in which we, this was coined, by the way, by Alexei Lidov, and it's turned into a whole area of study, and it's very, very interesting, especially for those of us who don't come from an art history background, for example. It examines the way in which we ourselves create or mark sacred space. And the best example would probably be the use of icons, how iconic space is created by the placement, use, ritual accompaniment of icons in church buildings, but elsewhere as well. Another example of hierotopic device could be, for example, the calendar, marking off certain times of the year as sacred, and processions, of course, are very important. And when we think about processions, there's a really interesting example of, I think it was every Tuesday for a couple of centuries in Constantinople, there was a procession which marked off the marketplace, the main agora in Constantinople, where a large Ordigetria icon of the Mother of God was taken out and would levitate. I believe it was every Tuesday. Someone please correct me. And why this is interesting to me is that it is blessing, sacralizing a very kind of profane or mundane space, somewhere where people aren't on their best behavior, are bartering with one another, all kinds of ordinary human behaviors. And so we have a mixing then of sacred and profane space. And of course, we ritually consecrate things over and over and over again, entire cities, the ocean, for example. And so this complicates in some ways. It's a very useful term to describe what we do as Christians, and this is true of other traditions, of course, as well. But it complicates this dichotomy between sacred space and profane space. In fact, it's really not a binary like that. And we see that with these mass consecrations. Of course, we've now moved sort of beyond the idea of the sacred city. Augustine, of course, reconsidered it, right, with the city of God. But then after we lost, after Constantinople was lost as well, we think about these things in a different way. Traveling icons, traveling relics, traveling holy men, living saints, holy men and women, complicate this and make us sort of reevaluate where the sacred and the profane meet. Is there a clear distinction? Can there be? Do we actually want there to be? I think that sometimes we do firmly want to step out of sacred space, in fact. I think that that's necessary sometimes, okay? We can't always be prostrate before the image of God. We need freedom. And I think that, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this is the fact that we are now encountering a time when many of us cannot physically visit our churches. And we're realizing, many of us for the first time, that the presence of God is not exclusively tied up in the physical location of the church. And if we are going to conduct ourselves in a Christian manner, we need to be aware of that. And we construct spaces in our own homes. We reevaluate whether we live in a sacred or a profane environment, and how we can orientate ourselves towards that. And so I did mention holy mountains, but the reason that I talk about the holy mountain is because for those of you that are on Facebook that have lots of people in the Orthodox world on there, there are just bucket loads of images of the holy mountain all the time, right? People post them because they are mementos. They want to be reminded, but also they sacralize their image as well in a way, the public image. You make a decision what photographs you are going to upload on social media, right? You create a kind of a separate image of yourself there. But I got thinking about this because I think that the Holy Mountain now is becoming, because of the relative ease, present circumstance excluded, of modern travel, and of media coming out of of the Holy Mountain, audio recordings, pictures, photographs, and the repetition of architectural devices, that it is becoming a kind of new Jerusalem in the minds of people in the diaspora, or just in the West. And I say this not because they're on equal terms, but because it's a change in the way that people think about the Holy Mountain and the iconic space of the Holy Mountain, because it is by definition a place that is closed off. And so our image, the image to the person who had never visited is very different. There's a really excellent book by Professor Veronica Della Dora called Imagining Mount Athos, which deals with the way in which Athos has existed in our minds, and particularly in the minds of people that could never visit. Women, but not just women, people that cannot make that pilgrimage. And so we see these repetitions of iconic space of Mount Athos, and I see that it's influencing the way that things happen in churches even. That St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona, fairly close to me here, the Catholicon and a number of the buildings and shrines are exact reproductions, right, of physical spaces on Athos. Also, the cycle of the services is exactly the same. They are recreating an iconic image, much in the same way that Western pilgrims and others then created Jerusalem again and again in church architecture in the West. But I think that the way that we use these hierotopic devices in our daily lives is particularly interesting. You know, the presence of certain icons that are totally linked to a particular place, like the Pantanasa icon from Vatapedi, for example, is in many people's homes, and acathists are being prayed to it. We are participating, therefore, in that space. We are, yes, it's a recreation of that space, but it certainly is the same. This has happened in the Islamic context as well. There were, Umayyad architecture is essentially a reproduction of Byzantine architecture, right? With certain elements either left out because of Islamic sensibilities or new elements brought in, like the minaret or something. But if you take the case of Damascus, for example, the Grand Umayyad Mosque, it's a Byzantine structure, and actually Damascus itself was constructed, you could argue, as a restatement, a reproduction of Constantinople itself, in order to kind of invoke that imperial legitimacy and power, and for them to claim it for their own. It should also be noted that the reason that mosque is where it is because that's where the shrine of St. John the Baptist was, right? And the relics from the former Christian church basilica there were incorporated into the mosque as the primary means, I argue, of sanctification of that building as well. So before I confuse myself by rambling on too much, is there anything, Father, that you'd like to add to that? So I'm particularly interested, by the way, because you mentioned your church having the saints of the Universal Church on the one side, and then English saints on the other, and it truly is a shared, it's a shared space. I don't know if you could speak to that, and also the idea of secularization of an actual sacred space as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Father David. We did say that we will make this as conversational as we can, although we will have a separate sort of standalone interventions. Yes, I think. I mean, I took several notes while you were talking, and thank you for bringing this up about the a conversation about the church that we serve in Cambridge here, which is an Anglican church, and we share the space. I don't like the word rent, although yes, that is sort of what happens in reality in a way. But both us and the Anglican parish, we do use this language of this being a shared church, St. Giles's Church, where we are. And well, it is a Victorian church, so it's probably more adapt to the type of sort of maybe a little bit more high Anglican service that happens there, but also obviously the Orthodox worship that we do. And yes, the windows are stained glass, and they have sort of on the one side, as you said, you have images, icons, stained glass of the of saints from the beginning of the church, so of the fathers of the church, and so on. Then on the other side, you have images of more of the sort of English saints from Saint Edward and to Saint Dunstan, for example. What I always find interesting, without going on too much about this, is how adaptable the space is, and in a way how, and this is in a way what I will try to say in my presentation, how sacred space and sacred action are connected. There is a flexibility, there's a malleability, I suppose, in the way that one interacts with the church that we're in. That makes it sort of, that transforms it in a way from a place of Anglican worship to a place of Eastern Orthodox worship. It's very interesting to think that at the same altar, the priests are facing in the opposite directions, it's just. I don't know. It never felt to me, and this I have to say, I don't know whether there's something about, again, the way that I project, as you were saying, things or the congregation, but it never felt to me that I'm serving in a strange church, in an alien church, in a non-Orthodox church every time I'm in there. That to me is one of these great blessings. It does feel like home. And again, I think this is where sacred action and sacred space come together. I think one without the other will break each of these elements apart. I think you need sacred action to maintain, in a way, the space sacred, and the sacredness of the space solicits your sacred action. Your holy action in that sense, or holy orientation. And it occurs to me again, as you were speaking, and I took a note of it, that sacred space, I mean, I'm thinking in the Old Testament, for example, it never happens, sacred space never happens for its own sake. It's always there to be interacted with. It always elicits, it calls out for a kind of sacred response, whether in the naming of the place, as you see with Jacob, for example, or and from him with everyone else that has that type of experience of God in the Old Testament. There's this revelation element and kind of synergic experience of sacred space and sacred action.
I think that's very important. You know, I think, you know, when you talk about the role of action, the early Christians worshipping wherever they could, right? That their space was made sacred by the Eucharist itself, rather than an elaborate sort of consecration, and most, right, the altar even was a movable table, very kind of practical, so that the sacred action itself is the thing that sanctified the space, and maybe the space wouldn't be reused at all. And the other thing, there are limits as well, of course, to the sharing of space. Your example is a very good one, but I also think about, I think it was about 3 years ago, a well-meaning priest of one of the Australian dioceses had let out the church hall to for an Islamic event, the church hall, but the church hall became overcrowded, and so they were allowed to use the church. Now in the church, certain prayers were said, and it became, for that particular moment, of course, according to certain points of view, a mosque. And then the space was reconsecrated entirely, which is interesting. The ways in which there is flexibility, and that my mind also goes back to, because you mentioned one altar, but in Cyprus, in Frankish Cyprus, for example, and still today there are numerous churches with a Latin altar and an Orthodox altar in there as well. And so even if both communities worshipped at roughly the same time, there would not be pollution, shall we say, between the two, as it would have been maybe seen at that time. Negotiating space is very, very tricky, not just for us in our own homes and worshipping at home, but publicly as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, related to what you just said, I actually think, well, the altar is a portable altar in the church that I serve in, that we share. And just last Sunday, we're now serving just me and the chanter there in the church until the church fully reopens for services. And we were just moving a little bit the altar table to set up the altar for our service. And then the chanter he just came out to me saying, they have no relics in the table. And I said, of course they don't. I said that no, they don't. I said, we have relics in the antimission. But he was, again, he kind of realized that for the first time, although he's been serving with us for many years, but we never really had to move the altar table as such. So we kind of take those things for granted. But what I want to say, because I want to look at the positives in a way, is that serving in this shared church with this portable altar that one has to sort of set up almost at every service, I think has helped me transition to serving at home during the lockdown, because I was not allowed to serve in church. So myself and many other priests, at least here in the UK, we had to serve at home, create our own liturgical space, again, which was portable. Some priests were able to have kind of a semi-permanent altar. Others haven't. I wasn't able to have a fully permanent sort of altar like that. But I think, again, it wasn't easy, and maybe I'll talk more about this later in the question and answers, because that's an interesting conversation in itself. But somewhat having that experience of kind of being a missionary parish in a way, being and not having real roots, not being sort of tied down with the weight of space ownership, has made that transition a little bit easier for me, because fundamentally I was not doing anything different from what I was doing every Sunday in terms of setting up a space with a particular purpose, refocusing energy again. So this connection between space and action, to me, is sacred space and sacred action is a red thread, especially during this period of lockdown. But a downside of having a shared church and not really having a full iconostasis is that people will wander through the altar. And you just, if you particularly, at the end of a baptism, or particularly at the end of a wedding ceremony, people who only come to church for those type of services will generally sort of walk straight through to come to talk to you about getting their baptismal certificate or whatever. So I've had to adapt to that as well, and kind of gently educate people and tell them about that. But it's always made me think about this relationship that action and space have. So the intentionality of engagement with a particular space. So yeah, thank you very much for just touching on all those points, and for sort of allowing me the space to chip in.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. And one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is that these streamed services, for example, that is very interesting, because there isn't even necessarily a rearranging that occurs in the living room, presumably, or maybe there is. Maybe people do that. Maybe they bring icons. I don't know. I'd be very interested to know. When just before this call, I spoke about clothing, right? So when we're on our Zoom calls, we make sure that we look presentable, all of that kind of stuff, and it's kind of ritualistic. You dress for the job, all of these kind of things. But what about when we are broadcasting church services? It entirely changes the way in which a person interacts with the sacred, and indeed the way that sacred space is constructed. It's got multiple tiers. The fact that we can pause and rewind a service, for example, also is something that I find really, really fascinating. That we have control over that time, and in a way, it's an illusion, right? Because if we pause something, if we watch a recording of it, how are we participating? We're participating with an event that happened in the past. But why is that important, or any more important than the fact that we've attended at some other point in the past as well? I find the streaming of services to be really sort of tricky, really, really tricky. It's almost like, seeing icons in a person's home with curtains on them that can be drawn closed whenever something naughty is about to happen, or when you don't want to profane a space, for example.
Yeah. Well, one way that I've come to terms in a way with this, as you were saying, sort of the ability of someone to rewind or to pause a service and so on. One way I've come to terms with this is to actually think of how we engage with Scripture. We always go back to Scripture. We reread a passage. I've reread the Psalter at least a couple of times with my parish during this period, as we were doing sort of set times for worship, for prayer. Me sort of streaming it audio from my home and seeing how people connect to the stream, and then some of them posting just a message saying, "Thank you, Father, it really helps," and so on. So and the first time that we went through the Psalms, for example, I at least had compared to the second time around, had almost like it's like almost two different experiences, because you have a different memory of them, you have a different experience in a way every time, but it's fine. We always go back to scripture. We sometimes pause, we rewind, we go back to, we all sometimes sort of fast forward, and just to find what we're interested. And I know that this is tied into what one might call kind of this consumerist culture, kind of in this secular context of kind of religious market, where you get your fix almost from a screen and so on. But I also think it's a challenge for people to take this engagement with prayer, with worship, with their identity more seriously. And as I think it is for any minister, for any priest, for any clergy that has to do that. I was talking last week, and we were talking with an Anglican priest who was saying that he finds it so tiring, like twice more tiring, streaming services than it is to do it in real life, and it feels like someone's always watching you, because you have that thing in the back of your head that there's a camera recording, or that somehow you can't go back. You can go back if there's a mistake, or if there's something. So I think it takes adaptation on everyone's side. But to me, what helps us go through this, as I said in a way, is comparing this with our normal action, like reading scripture, but also like focusing on not on these on the process in itself, but on the end goal, on asking the question, why are we doing this? And again, maybe this goes back to an ontological need that you were mentioning at the beginning, when we talk about sacred spaces and sacred experiences in that sense. Yeah.
Well, perhaps if you have nothing more to add, Father Dragos or Deacon David, we could open the floor for questions to the participants. Dear friends, if you haven't discovered by now the small blue little hand at the bottom of the participants menu, here's your chance to do it. It's good when you raise the hand, as it were, by using the, so if you click on the button at the bottom that says participants, and once you have this panel to the right-hand side open, at the bottom of it, there is a small button with a little hand that signifies, oh, I've seen, okay, somebody's done it. Okay, let me unmute someone whose name is iPhone.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Hello. Oh, hey. I'm sorry, I lost my screen for a second. Well, I can't see you right now, but you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Wonderful. First of all, I apologize. I was in the park exercising when I found out about the podcast. So it may be a bit loud in the background, but so I was interested in the Celtic traditions. There we go. From way back, I converted to Orthodoxy about 10 years ago, and part of the Celtic tradition is connected to that. So, in that would be the thin places, you know, and the that were the places where the veil between the two worlds is much thinner than other places, and so forth. I think my question is that would be: is it a mistake to call a sacred place the same as a sacred space? And if there is would we say that there's any sort of like in the church consecrated ground, I would assume that there is a, I don't know, I don't want, I would say like a type of authority associated with it. It's consecrated, it's, you know, so forth. And could we say the same about a place in nature that is recognized as a thin space? I may be getting off into a mysticism thing, but it was just sort of all that was coming to mind.
Can I respond? I would thank you very much. That's a very, very interesting question. And yeah, if we think about, you know, I mean, talking about mountains, of course, mountains have always been something that hold our attention as places that are closer to heaven. And if we think about geography from a psychological perspective, they are very important on a map. You know, we think about geography from a psychological perspective all of the time. If you ask a child to draw a map of the, you know, draw an atlas, their particular country will be the most prominent, right? Or the features that they find most awe-inspiring or whatever are the ones that are drawn on the map. When you mention the Celtic tradition, from my own experience from reading the Mabinogi on, you know, as it's mostly known, the entrance to the other world is never observed by the person who enters the other world, and they can only tell, right, that they're in the other world by the presence of strangely colored animals and things like that. You know, red and white animals let you know that you have now entered into the other world. But certain places, specifically geographical features, are really, really important still in the Celtic tradition, which is why in Wales, you know, you have everything is, you know, if it's not named after a saint, it's after a hill, right? Bryn something or other. And in response to the idea of space versus place, I think this is really important. But when we talk about a space, in this case, topos, we're talking about something that is cut off, that is physically defined. And the word for sacred, the word that sacred is taken from Latin for cut off, right? Divorced from the area around it. So it is an important distinction I think is lost to us now. But I think it's very natural to us, you know, if Christ was born in a cave and you know, was baptized in a river, was crucified on a hill, was transfigured on a mountain, the, you know, geographical features and spaces are extremely important. That's just a comment, really. I'm not sure if that answers anything.
Yes.
Okay, well, we have two more questions, one from Elizabeth and one from Christoph and another one from Chris. But let's start with Elizabeth, and I'll unmute Elizabeth now. Okay, Elizabeth, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, yes. Let me see if I can put the yeah, I can put the video on. Yeah, I thank you for, you know, a really fascinating presentation. I was quite taken aback, though, by the starting point of a sacred space as something in contradistinction to the profane. And I can see partly that has to do with the distinction between sacred space and sacred place. On the other hand, surely it's a basic consequence of the incarnation that this distinction is blown apart. I mean, thinking of Chrysostom saying that, you know, Christ was crucified under the open sky because no longer are there distinct sacred spaces and everything else is profane, or St. Maximus talking about the nave as the image of the world, which is the sanctuary, heaven in potential. And one of the things that I find so fascinating and really a blessing about the lockdown and not being able to get to church is this reminder that everything is sacred space, everything is sacred place. You know, when I was very struck standing in front of my iconostasis when the priest was reading aloud the prayer, you know, with our entrance, may the hosts of angels enter. And I think, you know, goodness, does that mean that they're processing into my sitting room? Well, presumably it does. You know, would you agree that this, well, from what you were saying later, I think you would, that this apparent distinction between sacred and profane is actually very porous and very mixed?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that very, very thoughtful commentary. That's very, very interesting. And if we think about the incarnation, yeah, I think that's an excellent example. If everything is made up of of atoms and particles in the resurrected and ascended Christ, of course, we have the potentiality for redemption and deification of everything. Certainly, right? I think that's a wonderful thing. I think yes, the networks of the sacred complicate this dichotomy, and I think that in some ways, you know, we try and enforce a barrier between the sacred and the profane because it's easier for us to deal with it, and since our behavior is in many ways controlled by which space we find ourselves in, I think that it's you know, something that is part of our makeup and is probably not grounded in reality when we take these other things into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Christoph has waited for a while. I'll unmute him now. Christoph, can you say something?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for your talks. I think my point is related to Elizabeth's comment, and I think in Christianity and particularly in Orthodox Christianity, there is a very interesting interplay between God's universal presence and God's particular presence, meaning God's presence in particular places or spaces, and these two poles are very important. And if one overemphasizes one aspect, it becomes dangerous in the sense if you overemphasize the particular, God's particular presence, then we have something like a magical understanding of the divine, like God is present in a box or something like this, which is problematic. And if you overemphasize the universal aspect at the expense of the particular, then you have a kind of, inevitably, I think, a kind of secularization is taking place. So without being polemical, that happened in Protestantism to some extent. You know, because of course we also pray God is everywhere present and feels all things, and we have the doctrine of the logi of creation. So God is of course everywhere present, but then this universal notion is counterbalanced by this notion of God's presence in the Eucharist, icon, sacred spaces, and so on. And I think both aspects are extremely important for healthy theology and church life. Do you agree?
I completely agree with you. Of course, you know, it's easy to fall into either of these categories. You know, the example I suppose in history is the destruction of the temple and what that did for the Jewish conception of their place in the world, but and also God's place. I think that that's very important. There is another way of thinking about the creation of space, and it's the other way around, in that instead of the sacred being made out of profane, the sacred space it can be considered the starting point, and rather so we make secular space out of that as well. I'm not sure, how that has played out in you mentioned in the Protestant thought world, but these theories of space are generally dealt with by anthropologists that are looking at human behavior and not trying to understand the particular presence of God, for example. It's about human behavior in relation to a perceived divinity rather than the actual, presence of God.
Okay, we have 3 more questions waiting. Let's see how many more we can squeeze in before breaking. We'll just take a short break in about 10 minutes or so before we go on to the second presentation. But let's proceed with Chris's question. Chris Compo, I've unmuted you now.
Hi. Do you think a sacred space could be temporary? So, if God was to have you had a visitation, say here now in my room, would that make it a sacred space, or would that make it just a temporal? I mean, the early and long-standing sacred places, surely God did something with the person there that they then dedicated that space and started to worship God there. So can something be a sacred space for a short period of time? Maybe I was thinking, like with the Divine Liturgy, it's not just that we're in the church or even at home participating. People, for myself, I interact as if I was there in the church building. So for me, there's little difference apart from I'm missing the fellowship of my friends and the familyness of our church. But also, when we're praying and worshiping God, it's not just in a sacred place, but it's a sacred time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite overlooked. It's that you're dedicating time, you're sacrificing your time to be there. So it's transcendent of more than just the physical place. And my last thing was about the streaming. I'm a fairly recent convert to Orthodoxy from a very charismatic Baptist background, and I found my friends from other churches, because I created a watch party of our church live stream. I found my friends and family joining in to have a look. So I found it to be quite evangelistic in a sense, where people that would not otherwise have seen Orthodoxy unless I'd have shared that live stream. So for me, it's been an extra tool to introduce people to what I've now discovered.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and really interesting point that you raised, and your final point, because as a teacher as well, I've noticed that teaching online presents certain problems, naturally, you expect, but also that certain students who are very quiet in person are freer online. Not just, I think, because they're used to the medium of expressing themselves online, but because there is a degree of separation and anonymity. And you can have a little bit of, you're a little bit more secure in some ways. So I can understand why a person, rather than committing to, 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday, going to an Orthodox church for the first time, being very intimidated, this would be something that would be very valuable. Yeah. And then, your point about time, yes, it's, we live in sacred time. Our calendar, are the days of the week, right, are dedicated and set aside to certain events and certain saints. And if you just think about the 12 feast days, the major feast days of the Christian calendar, they aren't just recollections. They are a way for us to be physically present at those specific important moments in the history of salvation. Just as when we are present at the Divine Liturgy, it is not merely a memorial, but we are there in the presence of Christ at that very moment as well. I think you're right. Time is overlooked. But the way that we think about time is changing enormously based on just this pandemic as well. But a temporary space, what you were describing about the vision or the revelation of God and then the building, what you were describing perfectly is hierotopy, because that the creation of the physical environment in which that happened, that is hierotopy. And whether that place can ever be returned is, beyond, I wouldn't dare to answer a question like that. There are different views regarding it. One of them, of course, is the ontological view, and the other is situational. If there is no one to remember that event ever happened in that particular space, is it still a sacred space? It depends on your point of view, I suppose.
Can I just say something in addition to that, Father David, briefly before we go to the next question? 2 things about the streaming and about the temporary element. It's just to say that in Romania, which is the context I'm familiar with, the Patriarchate has been broadcasting, now we can say streaming, but it's been broadcasting the liturgy and the services for, I think it's more than a decade. It started on radio and then it moved on TV, and there's a dedicated TV station of the Romanian Patriarchate, and they do this. I'm sure now it's the case in Russia, and I think probably in other countries as well. So this is commonplace now. I mean, I think when it started, it really felt like a novelty, and I suppose something that people might have deemed as a secularizing influence. But now it's moved into the exact opposite direction, as it were, and it's as you've mentioned, as a mission tool, as a way to sort of for the church to reach out in ways that it can't otherwise. So I think it is a question of getting used to something and then making sense of it, in a sense, to a degree. Of course, the risk of sort of watching from home rather than not attending in church is always there, and this needs to be considered. But this stigma, in a way, that one puts on new things that we try, particularly in church, eventually it either goes away because the practice of it will validate it. If it's something that it's in the very tradition of the church, if something is not organically received by the church, it will be organically removed, I suppose. And then the second thing is, a friend of mine just today said that they're holidaying in Romania, in the mountains, and as they were walking about, they came upon a group of archaeologists who were doing a dig And as they were digging in the process, they found the foundations of a 15th century church.
Wow.
And I was thinking, as you were saying, is that was a church there, and for some reason people forgot about it. It was covered by the earth. Stuff grew on it. There was probably nobody who really remembered that there was a church, so they just chanced on it. So now that they've rediscovered it, I mean, was that type of sanctity laying dormant? How are they going? They're treating now that space differently, and so on. So again, I think it's always multi-layered. You always have these things happening at the same time, and I think, okay, people will project something on the space, but why are they doing that? Because that space was consecrated before that, so they're probably recognizing something that's already there in that sense. So my instinct would be to never go in with very hard lines into these things, because it's very much a question of sensitivity. And I think we're entering into what we can only sort of refer to as kind of the tangible mystical in the sense in our church experience or in our faith experience.